Hello, you're listening once again to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane. On this episode, I'm delighted to once again invite Jonn Elledge to speak about his latest book, A History of the World in 47 Borders. Well, I'm delighted to have a repeat guest once again on the Booking Club, the author and journalist previously on to discuss with his co-author Tom Phillips, Conspiracy, A History of Bollocks Theories and How Not to Fall for Them, and on this episode discussing his latest book, A History of the World in 47 Borders. This is Jonn Elledge. It's great to have you back, Jonn. How have you been?
I'm not bad. I've been, I just had some figures through from my agent yesterday. Apparently I am only about 180 hardbacks behind Liz Truss, so should hopefully overtake her in the next week or two. So that's very exciting. They'll be able to say I sold more than the Prime Minister.
Was this a goal from the outset?
No. This is just my when my agent was explaining the figures, he happened to mention, this is how you stand relative to Liz Truss, and it's like that's a good sales technique, isn't it? It does work surprisingly well. If I just say this is how many behind I am, it does get a bunch of people buying it. So it's all about the money. I'm shameless.
Now that you know that you're slightly behind Liz Truss, has it just stuck in your craw?
I mean, it is a little bit offensive, isn't it? Like, I'm really proud of this book, and she's Liz Truss. But, different books have very different kind of sales arcs. Like, a political book will generally sell mostly up front. All the people who are going to buy it tend to buy it quite quickly. But she does seem to still be ticking away. So I don't know if there's actually a huge army of Trussites out there we previously unsuspected.
Well, there's certainly a large army of centrist dads out there in the world. And I believe when this book was first announced, somebody said that this was the perfect dad Christmas gift.
Oh, yeah, dads are a huge book. I mean, it's what do you buy your dad for Christmas? He likes maps. That'll do. There you go. It's very much the business model. But that's kind of my entire career is dads and curious 12-year-olds, really, are kind of my two main markets.
Two markets that like to be spoken to as adults, but in particular with dads as mates. And I love the way that you've written this book, because it very much feels like somebody talking to you at a bar or a pub. It's just your style, isn't it?
It is. It's sort of the way I've been writing for years, but I think a large chunk of that is one of my favourite, one of my sort of literary heroes, as it were, is Bill Bryson. I read Notes from a Small Island when I was 15, 16, and it's just like, it sort of opened my eyes slightly to the idea you can like talk about big issues but make them funny, and also put yourself in there. And I'm incapable of not putting myself into anything. So it's a book about history and geography and national identity and all that jazz. But also it's going to have jokes in it, because that's just the way
jokes
I speak
plenty.
about everything.
Jokes are plenty. Yeah, I know. I laughed a lot through this. Already highly recommended from my side of things. But we're sat here at Bellinger on Islington Green in Angel. So I wonder whether you could take us through the reasoning behind this choice.
So I used to live around here for a very long time, about 12 years, in a couple of flats with my ex. And I sort of lost Islington in the breakup. You know what it's like, the end of a relationship. You sometimes switch parts of town just so you're not banging into each other all the time. And this place had just opened at that point. Had a couple of lovely meals here. And I just remembered it's excellent cuisine, and it's a good bit of town which I don't spend enough time in anymore. It's now been long enough. I think it would be safe if we ran into each other. So I thought it would be nice to kind of come and enjoy some French onion soup and some kind of Middle European cuisine.
If I'm not mistaken, this used to be a Côte brasserie.
I believe it was, yes. But it's a very nice setting. It's kind of that sort of fin de siècle Paris kind of vibe with red leather booths and lots of kind of play posters with, yes, that's the Moulin Rouge just above us there. So I'm very much looking forward to some French onion soup.
You're a journalist and writer who, by his own admission, relishes the fine details of how places are created and organised, whether through grand transportation projects or invisible laws. But does this book respond to a particular need that you perceive for us all to understand better how places exist as they do?
I should really come up with a grand answer suggesting that, yes, I really do think at this moment in history, that's an extremely important thing. But no, it would be a complete lie. So I've been interested in borders for a long time, in borders in a very broad sense, not just national borders. But I've been interested in a lot of the issues around them. So I used to work at the New Statesman. There's a website called City Metric, which was about cities, urbanism, geography, transport, and so on. And I ran a series of pieces there under the heading Boundary Issues about silly borders. So that was kind of a couple of those kind of found their way into the book. Even further back than that, I was sort of interested in the question of where London ended. On the slightly self-serving grounds that I grew up in an outer London borough that nobody thinks of as outer London. And it was very important to me that I grew up in Greater London, not Essex. So I was kind of interested in the kind of identity formation questions there. But also a lot of the things I found very interesting to kind of delve into the last few years. There's an excellent Radio 4 documentary strand, presented by Misha Glennie and produced by Miles Ward, called The Invention of, How to Invent a Country. So the first one was the invention of Germany or the invention of Spain. And it's these kind of little potted histories about both territorial formation, but also the identity questions that go along with it. There's a series of books by a guy called Simon Winder, Simon Winder? I can never remember, but he works in publishing. He's written a series of books about Europe called Germania, Danubia, and Lotharingia, which are kind of about the funny histories of kind of Central European identities and Germany and the Habsburg Empire and so on. That was a big influence. And also I was scouting around after writing Conspiracy, trying to work out what to write next. And I wanted something where I could do a bit of history and a bit of geography stuff and like just some stories about human stupidity. And Agnes Frimston, my late fiancée, who sadly died actually the day I finished the book, which is ridiculous. Like it does kind of feel you're in like a bad Roman clef or something. But it was actually she who kind of suggested, well, you could just do something about borders. Like that's been a sort of big line of interest for you. And it was just a really good structure to kind of tell lots of different types of stories about different things I was into.
I got an early proof of the book where the dedication page is unmarked, but need I ask?
And it is Agnes. So I think the exact words are, for Agnes, God, I wish you were here to see this, or something. Because I wouldn't have written the book without her, and I wouldn't be who I am without her.
So here's our waitress. A French onion soup for Jonn.
Yes.
For starters.
And then the confit de canard, please.
And I think for me, I'll have the steak tartare starter. And then the choucroute garni.
Could I get some French fries?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. What do you think this propensity to draw lines on a map says about our species?
Ooh, that's a big question, which I'm not sure the book manages to answer in the slightest.
But that's kind of what the book is about, in a way, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I do think one of the things I took away from writing these stories is it does feel like a universal impulse. And I don't think it's like borders are a kind of physical manifestation of this impulse to divide us from them. And so much identity is constructed not just by talking about how you differ from someone. I think that's the primary way it's constructed. I think like a lot of the strongest identities are those that are slightly oppositional in some way. So like Scottishness or Welshness are to some extent defined as not Englishness in a way that doesn't work the other way round. There was a very interesting row on Twitter the other day when my former colleague Stephen Bush of the Financial Times made a point that like it's hard to distinguish English and British identities because the English make up 85% of the population of Britain. You know, it's mathematically they are very, very similar. And a lot of people got very mad and kind of racist about that, as if like he was trying to erase English identity. I don't think that's true at all. But I do think it's like there is a difference between how a dominant identity defines itself against a bigger one and how a smaller one will. So I feel like I'm rambling slightly, but I think like the sort of oppositional nature of it, like the English are the in-group in Britain, whereas the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish are the out-group. They're the minorities. What was the original question? I've gone way down a rabbit hole.
No, not at all. I think this is very interesting. I mean, you've kind of gone down the road of ethnography and ethnicity, but it's more the decision to physically carve up space. And as you say, during the British Empire, people would do this without ever having visited the places they were carving up.
So to some extent, it's an administrative thing. It's like, if you're running a polity, on the most basic level, you need to know who is in and who is out. So, like, to think of an example that doesn't seem particularly to matter, there have been internal border disputes in Australia, where Victorian surveying technology was not as good as it is today, and like borders defined by particular geographic markers like meridians or something turn out to be a bit wrong from where they were meant to be. And that sounds like it shouldn't particularly matter whether something is Queensland or the Northern Territory. But it does matter because you need to know who you're paying tax to. You need to know who's in charge of the roads and so on. So to some extent, like, the creation of borders is kind of inherent to the creation of the modern nation state. But I do think there is something more primal than that.
Yes, I was going to say.
That goes much deeper, that does come out of the need to kind of define your tribe. Like, it would once have literally been your tribe. So the oldest international border I could find, with which I begin the book, was the story of Upper and Lower Egypt, and about which were unified by a king, by Pharaoh, the first Pharaoh, in about 3000 BC. And there's all sorts of complexities here where it's like, it turns out there might not have just been two kingdoms. The border might not have been where it's kind of gone down in history as being, but nonetheless, there is that kind of story of unification. And that persists as a symbol of Egyptian identity for the whole of ancient Egypt, like another 3,000 years, basically. Pharaoh is the guy who can bind Egypt together. So, like, I found it really interesting that firstly, that we have an example of a border from 3000 BC. That's 3,000 years before history even starts on this island. That's going back a very long way. That's like almost the oldest event in human history. The oldest political event is the erasure of that border. But also that it persists as like, all the symbolism of ancient Egypt was like the crown of the two kingdoms, the land of the sedge and the bee, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. And just this idea that, the unification and erasure of that border is so core to the ancient Egyptian sense of identity. So that just to me speaks of like how primal an impulse this is. That is literally there at the beginning of human history. And it changes over the millennia. Like, I think I talk a bit about how in the ancient empires of, Rome or ancient China, which dynasty would it have been? Han China. The idea of a border was something a bit different to the way we perceive it now. Like, those empires would probably have kind of mostly faced onto wilderness or kind of like unincorporated territories. So Hadrian's Wall, for example, was probably not literally the sort of just like the end of the world that we sometimes perceive it as. It would be more of a tripwire. And the land slightly inside it would probably not have been as Romanized as southeast of England. But it also, the land outside it wouldn't have been completely beyond Roman control. It was almost a sort of customs barrier and a way of making sure that, like, Caledonian tribespeople could not attack Eboracum, York, en masse without warning. It wasn't like a hard line between us and them in the way we would perceive a national border now. But it's still very important to the function of the Roman Empire, would be a sense of where Rome stopped and something else began. So it really has been there for the whole of human history.
I don't know whether there's a term that's used to describe the way in which a writer steeped in a particular subject begins to see the themes of their book in everything. Have you noticed little things where people draw arbitrary borders, whether it's like a rucksack on a train seat, for example, or those dividers in the supermarket, or indeed any way in which people very surreptitiously, unconsciously mark out their territory? I mean, as you say, it is all around us. It is very primal, isn't it? This is a facet of human behaviour, not just of statecraft.
Yeah, I've not been looking out for them, but those are really interesting examples. A sort of vaguely kind of similar example that I didn't get into, like the last section of the book. So the book is in 3 sections. The first is like a fairly chronological history of kind of some of the important developments in the concept of borders, but also some of the more interesting borders through history. Then the next one kind of looks at borders that are kind of interesting or weird or still affecting the world today. And then the last section kind of goes a bit haywire. And it's not necessarily political borders in the same way. So I do time zones or the prime meridian or where space begins. It's the last essay of the book. One of the essays I considered writing but didn't in the end do would have been something on hedgerows.
Yes.
Because that is a very similar thing. Like
we are a nation of internal borders in that respect.
Yeah, but also there is that kind of sense of like hedgerows are, they're man-made, but they kind of create borders. Like if you put a hedgerow or a garden fence would be another example, 2 feet in the wrong direction, you can effectively claim someone else's land, and it becomes a bugger to kind of get it back.
One of my previous guests, Nick Hayes, I'm not sure if you're aware, the illustrator and author of the Book of Trespass, would be of great interest to you if you haven't read it already, based on this book. But it's essentially about the freedom to roam our own land in England and the various laws that have kept people from being able to do so. But
I think this is the exact same impulse, just at the micro level. Like a sense of like I've been telling the story of like my obsessive belief as a child that it really mattered that the London Borough of Havering was a London borough and not actually still in Essex. Thank you very much. But that's the same impulse. The idea of like, this is my identity is in some way formed by being part of X, not Y. It's where you feel ownership of and where it feels like foreign to you.
I do want to get us quite literally off the ground, because some of the most interesting chapters I found in the book were, as you alluded to there, on air and space. Let's start with airspace. How is the world above our heads divided along regional, national and supranational lines? This was really fascinating to learn about, and you won't find it on Google Maps or Google Earth.
No, I'm going to struggle to remember the terminology, but air traffic control, like the world is divided up into different sort of scales of air traffic control zones. So there are ones that are basically continent size, but the continents don't look like the ones like continents are slightly made up as well. Like there's an essay in the book about how Europe isn't real. But like the continents of the air, the regions, I think they're called, are not FCO regions, but then they're not the ones we're necessarily familiar with. So there's kind of a Central American and Caribbean one, but also the European one basically includes the whole of the Mediterranean, which the border between Europe and Africa to itself lies not in the Mediterranean, in the air traffic control world, but in the Sahara Desert. And the reason I find that quite interesting is that's basically where the ancients put that border. Like, as far as the Roman, or as far as the classical world was concerned, North Africa was part of the same system as Rome. And it was actually us here in Northern Europe that were kind of the weird foreign people. So below that you have, I still can't remember the terms, but there's bits that are basically the countries of the air. They've been referred to as. And every country, almost every country, very jealously guards its own air traffic space. Which, there's a single European sky initiative that Brussels has been pushing for a long time. And it sort of runs into the problem that if you don't have control of your airspace, that lessens your security. So even though it would make far more sense to fold, Belgium into the French air traffic control zone or something, the Belgians are not going to give that control up anytime soon. And then there's kind of more kind of local ones beneath that kind of shrink or grow depending on the number of flights in the sky. But I found this story interesting, firstly because, as with another of the stories in the book, the one about the divisions of Antarctica, it's kind of, it was nice to have a story of international cooperation in a book that is often about, territorial conflict. But also it was just a completely different way of seeing the world, and dividing up the world into unfamiliar pieces. And in the introduction to the book, I talk about how if you search the internet for a map of the world, you will almost certainly be presented with a map of the world's countries. And that's an assumption so embedded in us, it takes a moment to remember that is an assumption at all. And that is, there are other ways of mapping the world. And I just kind of found it interesting, kind of look at alternative views of this planet.
Is there a website that provides these multiple ways of viewing the world?
I have absolutely no idea.
There should be, right?
There should. I might set myself the task of finding one.
I think there should be a Google Maps equivalent that actually peels layers and layers on a whole encyclopedia of different topics of interest. As you say, language spheres. That'll be fascinating to look at. I'm just surprised that nobody's tried it yet.
Well, another lesson about that story from ancient Egypt, which I start the book with, is like, it is baffling if you kind of look at that now and think like this, a line somewhere around the 30th parallel was at one point an international border, and the two peoples on either side saw each other as very different. And 5,000 years later, that feels absolutely mad. And there is no reason that shouldn't apply to every other line on the map of the world. So maybe we shouldn't get too attached to them. So
how did you find the starter then, Jonn? The French onion soup that you said you were craving before we started recording?
Well, yes, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 2nd of October. The weather has very much turned to autumn. I'm wearing my favourite jumper. It's really time to lean in on the nights drawing in, I think. I've always been a fan of a French onion soup, and it felt like it suited the season. How was your steak tartare?
Steak tartare was good. Often I make the mistake of just tucking straight in and not doing the annoying thing of taking a photo of it for the gram, of course. When it comes to space then, getting back to our discussion of air borders and space borders, could you explain what the current state of play is among those, and the names won't surprise anyone, who would wish to use their power, money and influence to take control or command of the world above Earth's atmosphere? What's going on, Jonn?
So, current state of play I may struggle with. I can tell you what the state of play was in the summer of, I think it was 2021, which was when there was a sort of new space race between Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin, and Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic. And they were racing to be the first commercial company to get to manage human spaceflight. And Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic won. Richard Branson was posted live video from orbit, which nobody noticed because England was being knocked out of whichever football championship it was by Italy at the time. So that was quite funny.
Except if we're to believe Blue Origin's screwball.
Yes, but this is the question. Did he go to space at all? So he made it up, I think, 84 kilometres. And Blue Origin put out a statement congratulating him and then going, it's not really space though, is it? Like, you would be any astronaut who did this, anyone who paid to be taken to 84 kilometres in the air, they're going to have an asterisk next to their name because they're not a proper astronaut. And it all came down to this thing called the Kármán line, which is named after a Hungarian physicist who basically argued that there was a point where aeronautics stops and astronautics, I suppose it is, begins, where basically you switch from flight to space flight. And according to Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic had not passed that point, and therefore Richard Branson had not, in fact, been to space. Now, actually, this is all very contested. The Kármán line doesn't define the beginning of space at all. There's all sorts of figures out there for exactly where it is. But it just kind of gave me, this is actually the suggestion of my former co-writer Tom Phillips, it just kind of gave a nice end to the book to kind of show that, even as mankind reaches for the stars, we're still arguing over where the bloody line is.
It was a particularly interesting chapter, especially the story of Dennis Hope, an American businessman recently divorced, who tells it that as he was driving in his car at night looking at the moon, and this was in the mid-'80s, he had a very 80s thought, which was, God, that's a lot of real estate.
Yeah, I can monetize that. Yeah.
And he did. He then found a loophole in the Outer Space Treaty and subsequently claimed ownership of the moon and sold it at, I think it was $24.99 a pop.
Yeah.
And made an estimated $12 million.
Which is incredible.
Incredible,
isn't it?
Absolutely.
So the Outer Space Treaty kind of defines how the countries of the world will use space and the limitations placed on that. And one of the clauses in it is that space doesn't belong to it can't belong to any sovereign state. So, the US could not claim the moon. It's the heritage of all mankind kind of thing. And what Hope realised was that, well, I'm not a sovereign state. I can just claim it for myself. So he wrote to the UN saying he was going to do this, and he didn't get an answer. So he thought, okay, the moon's mine. I'm going to start selling it. And it was, it was nonsense. It was novelty gifts. It's, it's the sort of thing you could get as a joke birthday present, isn't it? But fair play to Dennis Hope. He's made a bloody fortune.
As the book's title makes clear, there are many, many histories of borders charted throughout human civilization. We've spoken predominantly about those that are very much in the space above our heads. Space, as you mentioned in the book, is the final frontier. How worried are you about the future of borders in space, and how the essential differences between these and the kinds of borders that can be drawn on firm terrain pose an inherent threat to national security and the stability of international relations?
I mean, I think it's a different potential theatre of war. So there is this thing called the Artemis Accords, which the US and its allies have all signed, which basically defines not actual sort of sovereign territory, but like the way you can kind of use the moon. It creates these things called safety zones. So like if the US has a sort of uncrewed mining operation up there, then that is kind of a US operation. Other countries can't just kind of ramble in there and start taking stuff out. So that's the Artemis Accords. They define the rules around this. The problem is they've not been signed by either Russia or China. And those are the other two countries most likely to actually be doing this stuff, I think. So I do think there is a danger of countries clashing in over territorial rights on the moon rather than down on Earth. But also, like, another reason this argument about the Kármán line actually matters is as part of national sovereignty, you get the airspace above your country. Like the air above Britain is Britain's airspace. This is why the air traffic control is run from Heathrow or up north somewhere. It's just outside Glasgow, isn't it? Prestwick, I think. But yeah, so like you get as a sovereign state, you get national airspace, but at some point that has to stop. Like you can't just kind of imagine this tube extending out into the universe. So the argument about where space begins is also an argument about where national airspace ends and sort of low orbit space begins, because it's perfectly permissible to put a satellite above a country if it's still in space. So like there are all these sort of potential grounds for conflict. That's a terrible pun. There are these potential reasons for conflict coming out of space. But I do think it's just an extension of the same territorial impulse that's been driving us for 5,000 years, ever since those ancient Egyptians kind of decided where Upper Egypt ended and Lower Egypt began.
And that brings us back beautifully full circle. Apologies to history buffs if you wanted more on the past. I know we've been speaking predominantly about the present and the future, but there is plenty for you to read in this book. Get it for yourself, get it this Christmas.
Brilliant Christmas present. Tell your mates.
Listen, Jonn, thanks very much for meeting me here today at Bellinger, and I wish you all the best in the sale of this book and with your future projects as an author.
Thank you for having me, Jack.